Sanbonani, Morweni, Dumelan, Dimadegwa, Abshe, Fuena. It's such, I'm humbled by the invitation to come and share some points and some thoughts on what has been topical in the last few weeks, and perhaps since the beginning of the year, and even beyond. Remember that since last year, the debate around policy issues, and since the NGC of the ANC, the issues raised by the Youth League, it's been an exceedingly fascinating, intriguing, and yet very difficult to apprehend experience. But now, no one can understand what has been happening without looking at the broader context, because if you isolate the policy conference itself, you're most likely going to miss some of the underlying nuances of that policy conference. I would like to preface my presentation with the quotation from the great psychologist Frantz Fanon, who in his book says, "The Wretched of the Earth," that is the title of the book, each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. When we reflect on the 100 years of the ANC, we are fascinated by what each generation had to grapple with, the issues of the time. When we look at the cohort of leadership of 1994, we're fascinated by what they had to deal with at the beginning. Then I move on to the next excerpt from The Tale of Two Cities, the opening stanza, which says, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." It's the best of times because we can say we did finally cross the Rubicon in 1994. It's the best of times because the whole world is actually celebrating our homegrown political settlement, our constitution, and many other democratic institutions that we put in place, the restoration of our dignity, because now there are no institutionalized legal prohibitions for people to mix and move. But it's the worst of times because of the paradoxic nature of this transition, wherein we realize 18 years into our democracy that the apartheid geography in the main remains. When you talk inequality, when you talk poverty, when you talk unemployment, fundamentally they are still defined structurally and systematically along the same ways. The settlement patterns, If you fly to Cape Town, as you approach the airport, on the other side of the highway will be the informal settlements. On the other side of the road will be the estates with swimming pools, green spots behind the yard everywhere. As you fly in, you wouldn't mistake who stays on the other side of the road. It's the worst of times because the nation is restless. The fierce urgency of now as they demand relief on social and economic justice. So that is the context that I give. Yet another context I want to give as a preface. The Mandela generation of leadership helped to negotiate or initiate negotiations. And they helped us to cross the road. They helped us to assure those who were uncertain about our initial steps of transition. Therefore, in a biblical sense, mindful of religious diversities, of course, Madiba generation represented what I would call a Moses generation, taking people out of bondage. But that generation is not the one that will take us to the promised land. So if I evoke Reverend Finga in his memorial lecture of Tiosoga, we are in a curious period of time between times, of place between places. We are not where we were, and we are not where we're supposed to be. So the country is at a crossroads at the moment. Searching for answers, searching for roadmap, and the country is restless. The goodwill that we cultivated in the initial years is gone. The public discourse is toxic and foul in the main. Whether you listen to Malema using the rough edges of his tongue, or you listen to Dr. Mulder talking about the 40% that the Bantus do not belong to historically, or Helen Zille talking about the refugees from the Eastern Cape, or the painting that was in the news, or Zapiro's cartoons. Ten years ago, political parties would sit and discuss policies for 90% of their times. The first ANC conference in this city at Durban, Westfield in 1991, accreditation was not an issue. People walked through. In the main, it was the policy issues. What do we make out of the future of this country? Fast forward to that. Today, 90% of the conference is about accreditation. Who is to be pushed forward? Mainly the contestation over positions, because you have to access state resources and then feed into the patronage networks. The contest in the main is not about policy, ideological or philosophical differences. Now the search for Joshua generation continues. Then let me begin. I do not have a PowerPoint, but I hope I'll still make a point with power. It has become obvious to most observers that our transition was far more complex than we first thought of. But it was under-theorized and poorly analyzed. We lacked the tools to unpack, to project, to clinically dissect what was happening. Hence, we limp from one news headline to the other without any consistent, rigorous, robust interrogation of issues. Sometimes we mistake people who are invited into the media for sound bites and say these are public intellectuals, people like myself, and who are given the honor we don't deserve. In this country, there is no public intellectual in the making. We move from one subject to the other, depending on what is in the headlines, news, they give you 3 minutes, 5 minutes, you must quickly roll your tongue, then you pretend to be something. But if you look back at people who had engaged in public discourse, whether it's Solomon Blakey in their times, or it's Mkai in their times, these people were knowledge workers who took on the societal problems and lived them and worked and processed knowledge in the public spaces and in their lives of activism. But today, indeed, either we are consultants, today they say you should do the child abortion, the other day you must do something else, the other day you must do something else, or we are chasing tenders, or we're doing all these other things. There's no focus. Or a class that we can say is the intelligentsia in the society. Why is that the case? I want to start there before I even go to the policy issues. There are a number of factors. The first one, the small limited black intelligentsia that was there was quickly absorbed by the private sector and government. Promise of big positions, big money, big houses, big cars, travel around the world was too seductive for many to avoid. The second one is that in South Africa, we often think that to service reconciliation, you must avoid anything that sounds sensitive or controversial. So we therefore suffer honesty deficit. And as a result, many South Africans have dual consciousness. The truth you speak in public, and the truth you speak in private. And we've mastered the art. Now, no society can truly have social cohesion or craft a clear vision if there is no clarity in terms of honesty. That honesty deficit is linked to courage deficit. We lack courage. We lack political will. which in the main has led to some of the most basic things not being attended to. And many leaders, be they in the private or public sector, do things as per job description rather than out of the courage of their conviction. The notion of South African exceptionalism, which was deployed in the past by colonial and apartheid governments, has been embraced by the new elite. We are different from the rest. In the past, it was deployed to say we are geographically in Africa, but culturally, spiritually, we are not part of the rest. Currently, we use it as a bragging right to say we can't be like them. That South African exceptionalism has then robbed us of a wonderful opportunity to compare ourselves scientifically with post-colonial countries and see how they fall into some of the traps that we're now gradually falling into. We used to think that those who were in exile, because we're the last born in the independence movement, would have learned all bad things that ought to be avoided. But unfortunately, I don't think that was the case. So the students were not as good because they mixed both bad lessons and good lessons. But now let's come back to the policy. Every study has shown that South Africa has done well in establishing the architecture and the infrastructure of democracy. Textbooks are written about us. Our constitution, as I said earlier, is heralded as one of the best, most progressive. But when it comes to the socio-economic justice issues, we are trailing. More recent study by the World Bank has just cautioned that South Africa, with the kind of inequality, has well become one of the worst three, most unequal. And this happening during the time of our democracy. The most unequal society in the world. It used to be Brazil, but Brazil has long escaped them. But it didn't end there. For 10 successive years, South Africa had one of the most sustained economic growth, but it wasn't yielding jobs. It wasn't translating to wealth. But a few were getting richer and richer. And the social distance between the political and business elite and the rest of the population was widening. They no longer understood each other. They often needed translators and interpreters, because each side was convinced that it was doing all it could, but they were not understanding each other. The elite sent its children in the main to private schools, so they couldn't understand the plight of public schools. When they were sick, they sent their children into private hospitals, so they couldn't understand the 8-hour waiting for a Panadol prescription. Most of the time, the country was traveling. The best secretary would be the one who Googles for the next conference in Mexico, from Mexico to Singapore, from Singapore to Thailand. as long as you were bringing some cloth and some goodies for the secretary. We became one of the most traveled countries. Most South Africans, as I have observed, even when they arrive, they attend the opening ceremony. After that, they ask, where are the shops? And they leave the conference. Very often, no conference report upon return. Permanently airborne. Now, 2008, the global financial crisis starting in the US came, but its effect was delayed. 2009, it touched on us. We remember that close to 1 million jobs were lost. And some of these were your middle class, black middle class, who had seen how things are on the other side. Good things in life. When they lose that, at 1,700 cars were being repossessed in 1 month. 2,000 houses were being repossessed. Now, that pinch came, cushioned a little bit by the World Cup. The cost of living skyrocketed. A loaf of bread from 6 rands to 14 rands in 3 years. Petrol prices going up. Now, all these are happening and impacting on the ANC constituency. People started asking questions. Even where water had been provided for, the maintenance work, where electricity had been provided, people started struggling, paying. And within some sectors, the extractive part of government and the private sector is the one that was sharpening its claws at this time. SARS is one of the best performing government entities in the country. Sandra, toll gates, 23 rands this year, 33 rands next year. ESCOM, even municipalities which are very poor, they have no capacity, but they still have a bit of capacity to collect. It comes to that. Now, once the extractive power outpaces the delivery, at some point, that equilibrium tends to reach some friction point. So when you look at e-tolling, it's not just the e-tolling, it's the metaphor for other things. Then somewhere there was the Arab Spring. People were watching on their television what happens. The elite said, no, it won't happen here. No, let's not even think of it. But others were actually watching. Not that it will happen, but people have seen the most powerful people like Gaddafi being slaughtered in the back of a Baki Hilux Toyota by militias. They've seen the most powerful regimes, Hosni Mubarak, being wheeled to the court, such that the Time magazine said that year, it is the year of the protesters, because the power has shifted back to the people. Not only there, in London, you remember the youth riots. In South Africa, we escalated, protests actually moved from 200 to 1,000. Which means there is something that tells us that not only South Africa but the world is becoming restless. But now, in each one of the studies, the worst affected segments of our population is the youth. 73% of unemployed are the youth under 35 years. Most graduates, of late I assist even people with PhDs, they say for a year, I haven't had a job. Then somewhere you hear that, no, it's the alignment of skills. Then I sit in the interviews of people who want to be in the IT. You find 10,000 applications, people with IT, but not being absorbed. Then the Youth League found its chant when they talked of nationalization. They started falling in love with Mugabe and land grabs. They said, let's go check in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez. He said, let's go into Bolivia, Morales there. Because of this restlessness and their constituency beginning to bite at them, of course, it was quite paradoxical. As they were speaking that language, Malema could lead a march during the day for economic freedom. And then at night, he would wake up in purple suits in Mauritius, in a different setting altogether. That then tells us of the paradox of what leaders sometimes say and the life they lead. Malema, because of his crudeness and lack of finesse and sophistication, presented it in its crude form to us, but others are more refined, but it's still the same. Then the tensions were brewing. Union leaders were saying, if you are not being militant, you are going to lose your constituency. Because workers were beginning to feel the pinch. And remember, most black workers, because of apartheid geography, they spend most of their money on food and transport. Because they were pushed so far away from workplaces. Unlike in many other countries where you wake up, 5 minutes you're at work. Here you change 3 kumbis and avoid the near fatal accident at least twice a week. They were beginning to feel the pinch. People were losing the disposable income because of inflation. That's when people started asking, what has liberation done for us? On the other side, the right-wing forces had misread whatever reconciliation overtures that had been given. They were getting bolder. AfriForum was taking government to court every 3 weeks for something. Solidarity and so forth. So you could sense now that gloves were off on all sides. That's when policy debates started. That's when ANC alliance partners started asking, why did we go to Pulumane? What did we agree on? Has that been implemented? Not because of their choice, but because the constituency was becoming restless. Then come 2012, a very interesting year. a year like no other year in our history. There's never been such a crowded political calendar in South Africa's history as this year. 100th year anniversary of the ANC in Mangaung. Malema's expulsion together with the other ANC Youth League leaders. Alliance partners like SACP and COSATU holding their elective and policy conferences. ANC holding its own elective and policy conference in the same year. Regions and provinces holding their conferences. So this year is a busy year. When you have a 100th year anniversary, you have to justify why you exist and why you should continue to exist. So that's when now the tension came. As the preparation for the elective conference was coming. Now, the alliance partners themselves were suffering from the identity crisis because they had to explain within this space of time between Polokwane, because they had been instrumental in calling for change, in calling for the removal of the class of 1996. Going back to our constituencies, what could we possibly say are the radical steps that we've taken? So that is the context. And I see, the political leaders this side. I'm happy they are part of this particular engagement. And I'm happy that I had to go through the first stanza without noticing them. Not that I will edit and censure myself from this point onwards. Now, in this particular year, as we had seen in the NGC here in Durban, there's been a shift to say, let's go back to policy issues. There is a search for some new direction, and it is within that context that the National Planning Commission was set. But of course, National Planning Commission has been so low-key. You don't feel the buzz. You don't see the excitement that you saw when we were actually participating for the constitution making. And of course, even Trevor Manuel, I think he has run out of steam since he was moved from being a finance minister. I think he has lost interest. This is more technical about these things. The passion is not technical. Then this would have been a wonderful opportunity to engage the nation on policy issues. Now, very quickly, on the policy debate, key things came up. The one of nationalization, of course, expropriation of land. A debate that the youth was always hammering on, to a point where ANC had to conduct a research, march in response to that. But something came close to the conference as the documents were being released. ANC actually, it's an amazing organization. No other organization releases its policy documents to the whole nation to debate. So for that, it still carries that character of being a mass movement. Curiously, one document came talking of the second transition, and it became a touching stone. Why did the document on the second transition, on the strategy and tactics, document became, the title itself, not the content, became such a controversial, much debated concept? I think what the framers of the document were trying to say was that let's change the gear. We've always been focusing on the political. Now let's go to the social and economic. But now there was a conceptual problem, which I think Tony Yengeni, who led the group that crafted the document, repeated on 3 occasions as I listened to the media that we had a plan that the first 2 decades would focus on the political and then the second one. And yet that there has never been such a decision. That's why there was RDP. RDP was meant to tackle social and economic ills. Here we're meant to do the same as GISA. You mentioned them. All policies that were thrown just couldn't crack the deep structural issues. And besides, it would have been quite sensitive, if not insulting, to people to say, look, we let you starve just for 2 decades because we're still focusing on political. So that was the first problem with it, conceptually. Only the SACP has a very distinct concept of the 2 stages of the revolution. Because it said the first one would help the nationalists succeed in their national democratic revolution. But the next one would then proceed to implement socialist government. So the second problem was that seeing the ascendance of communist leaders and their influence, people started saying, is it not this 2-stage revolution being sneaked behind the door? There might be merit or no merit in that, but the perception is as strong as a fact, if not clarified. Gwede Mantashe was the chair of the SACP, also Secretary General this side. Lady Nzimande was the Secretary General of the SACP and quite an influential figure increasingly. So that was the one worry. That's why Khalima Motlanthe then, in one lecture, started raising issues that there is some, communist and Marxist jargon. The media then, which was always waiting for signals as to whether Motlanthe is throwing his head into the ring or not, said, aha, finally, we've seen him. He's challenging this document. So they sort of pitted President Jacob Zuma and Kgalema Motlanthe. And increasingly, for reasons which are quite difficult to apprehend, President Jacob Zuma, who usually steps back on these policy debates in order to say, I'll be a unifying figure, went in and started saying, second transition is the game in town. And people started saying, oh, we will see at the conference. Because tactically, there was no benefit for the president to get into this fray. And in the last dying days in Free State, he spoke in a very angry manner, which is unlike him, that the people who are not following this second transition, I don't have time for people like those. They must come with their own thing. I said, hey, this thing is now percolating into something. So the media would then sensationalize this and say in the red corner is Jacob Zuma's second transition, in the yellow corner is Kgalema Motlanthe, and so forth. The other reason second transition was understood to mean second term. If you have endorsed it, you'll go back to the branches and say, comrades, we're no longer discussing now, because in the previous policy conference, as you know, we had agreed. And it didn't help that KZN came out strongly to say, second transition, we support it. He said, ha, there you are. So they started reading these signals. And you know what became of second transition. It had to be re-edited. Though the content was not much altered, but the title had to be, it went some, should we say minor or radical surgery and a facelift of some kind, and it came as the second phase of the first transition. ANC is a genius when it comes to managing strategic ambiguity and moving forward with it. That's why when you think there's going to be a conflict, they walk away, each side saying we've won. They give press conference, they say we are so happy. You know, in 2007, I was traveling to monitor elections with Bandu Olomisa and other delegates. He said, how are they going to solve this Tabombeki thing in the NGC of that year? Was it a policy conference? Will they say he shouldn't run for a third term? Will they say he should run because this thing is causing conflict? I said, no, you don't know ANC. ANC will come with a master stroke phrase which will leave everybody happy. They said the conference has decided that it would have been preferred that you do not run. However, there is no constitutional prohibition for you not to run. So everybody walked away happy. There's always a consolation prize. The issue of nationalization. Of course, you knew that ANC had already sent signals that there would be no wholesale nationalization. For a number of reasons. ANC, because South African struggle was so internationalized, ANC tend to be extremely sensitive to global opinion. Even if it's the Moody's rating, they get worried. That's why the biggest project we've ever undertaken as a country is the World Cup when the world was coming. We couldn't fail in front of the world because we love and fear the world. So the international opinion matters. Sometimes I get worried that it matters more than the national interests. Maybe that's the reason we're loved and we always share many things in the global forums. It's because when China fights with the US, we say we hear your positions, we've come up with a middle ground. We never say our national interests are these ones. They say my national interest, they say my national interest. South Africa says, guys, let's live in peace. Sometimes. I'm sorry to disturb your peace this evening. the nationalization debate. It was not to be. Hence, ANC came up again with a very carefully coined position that of nationalizing in the strategic areas and strategic entities, such as exploring possibilities of bringing ESCOM, maybe Telcom, which in the first place were state entities that were unbundled. One couldn't fathom why South Africa would take away steel industry and sell it to Mittal and others, when you knew that economic growth would always depend on steel. Now the same steel, Mittal raises the prices and you want to grow and you go back to Mittal, say, can we, they say market prices. On mining, again, state mining company, which would then expand its operation over time. That was the lingo there. On land, willing seller, willing buyer. The minister once said, in fact, it was never a willing seller, willing buyer. It was a willing seller and an unwilling buyer because the prices were already too high. Then, the clause within the Constitution, Section 25, which speaks to restitution, will be fully utilized. And most important, the debate before the policy conference was that maybe we need to change the Constitution. In this case, both the President and in the outcome of the conference was that there is no need as such for that. You could still do the same within the confines of the Constitution. But again, it depends on how transformed the judiciary is. Because if you try to do that and the judiciary is not convinced, then you're back to square one. There are other things which media sort of brought in and say, you know, the wage subsidy, ANC had said, we support wage subsidy, the unions and the Youth League had said no. And they said no, mainstream ANC therefore was defeated because the wage subsidy was sort of quietly abandoned in favor of the assistance for the wage seekers. The youth service concept, which had come earlier from the Ministry of Defense and from the ANC itself, also came up in this conference. The issue of traditional courts again came up. I won't dwell into those, but I'll just go back quickly to the implications. The media tribunal, of course, also politely was abandoned because it was said that the recommendations of the commission that was led by Justice Langa came very close to the things that ANC wanted. In that score, actually, I think it is true because the media started making concessions. Once there was this call for media tribunal, media started apologizing a lot. And the apologies started being on the first page instead of 17th page. And they started accepting that they have weaknesses. But again, everybody walked away happy, saying, at least we told ourselves that we need to transform rather than ANC telling us. But we will try to transform nonetheless. So it was, a nice compromise in that sense. The issue of cadre training and the delayed ascendance to power until people acquire experience to be leaders within the ANC was also one of the policy positions taken. But now, other people ask themselves, the president and some leaders of the ANC have said, we are embarking on a radical shift. On the balance of scales, did we see a radical shift? The answer is no. It's a cautious tilting to focus on socio-economic issues. Secondly, it's not radically different from what was proposed in the Polokwane conference. Could we tell out of the policy conference who has won and what support was coming for December Mangaung? No. In terms of the media, they would say Zuma lost on the second transition, he lost on the traditional courts, and I don't even know why they link these things to him per se. But in reality, it's not a factional test of strength. As the situation stands now, he still is a person to beat, still has a competitive edge. But the problem is this one. Most of us are not really worried about who wins in December. Will ANC stabilize? Will ANC have unity within itself? Will ANC deal with the issues of discipline? Will ANC deal with the issues of poorly managed cadre deployment, of materialism, which has crept into its ranks, of factionalism? If a faction wins in December, then ANC has lost. It's as simple as that. But that will be a delayed loss, because it will be felt in 2014, in 2019, and ultimately. Because ANC is very unstable at the moment. You might have heard what happened in OR Tambo recently. You'll know what I'm talking about. If you heard what happened in the Nelson Mandela Metro, you know what I'm talking about. If you heard what happened in the Free State, you know what I'm talking about. In the Northwest, in some instances, it's a circus. Then the question to ask, if the organization is experiencing these volcanic eruptions inside its belly, will it have the capacity, the discipline, the clarity of vision to take us to the promised land? Looks like the main challenge that ANC is facing should be inward looking. Because with policies, there are so many policy initiatives that have come. South Africa is the best in terms of designing solutions, even in terms of diagnosis. The tenders. See, I was driving from a funeral on Sunday, and one song played, and I was driving with my wife. It said, "Love Me Tender." I said, hey, given the damage the tenders have done in this country, please change that song. They say people have become cynical. They say in Limpopo, a child when is born, you know, a child in a mystery of life, they first say Papa or Tata. Even if that person has disappeared and is not paying pap geld, they start pronouncing that whilst the mother is frustrated, trying to train them to say Mama. Then after a few months, they say Mama, to the relief of the mother. They say in Limpopo, then the next word they learn is tender. let's go back, not just to the ANC capacity. In the 70s and 80s, all scholars and activists had agreed that we were a colonialism of a special kind. Because both the colonizer and the colonized had been together long enough and they have permanent residence here with no prospects of anyone taking suitcases after the flag has been lowered, as it is the case elsewhere. But we've never come back to ask, what then are the implications of a post-colony of a special kind in terms of hegemonic power structures? Could it be, as Ali Mazrui said, that in South Africa, after the impasse and the compromise, we agreed that the black majority would be given the crown, whilst the minority would hold on to the jewel? If that is the case, where is the locus of power? Who defines and sets the national agenda? And what is that agenda? To give you a simple example, when Tony Yengeni came out of prison, he slaughtered a cow, and for 2 months the nation was debating the cruelty to animal inflicted by Tony Yengeni. Kind of night we were brought into forums to debate as if there was no HIV, AIDS and other problems. Then I was brought in with the leader of the group who talked of 1962 Act of Cruelty to Animals, and I said in my humble submission, for as long as I remember, live lobsters are boiled alive in the upmarket restaurants, and I've never heard of any debate of this nature. I don't know whether they are poor cousins of animals that were but in reality, it was simply showing the lack of multicultural consciousness and also showing the hegemonic power structures. In the social space and in the economic space, the political elite may have the political power, but it has not translated into power expression in those spaces. Whether you talk language, value systems, culture, that's why even the word Ubuntu was removed from the draft constitution in the preamble. Though it would be used cynically later, whenever you want to have a hate crime trial or something, you'd extract Ubuntu a little bit here and there. The monopoly capital, concentrated power structure in each sector in South Africa, even by market standards, power is concentrated within 2-3 players. If it's the banking sector, you know you're talking the big four. If it's the audit sector, you know you're talking the few. If you're talking energy, you know you're talking 1 or 2 players. Still, you know you're talking 1 or 2 players. Construction, even when these guys had actually defrauded the system and cheated, when they were being slapped with penalty by the competitions board, they said, this government would be out of its mind. I mean, this 300 billion of infrastructure building, without us, what would they do? That's power. Hard currency power. Now, political leaders, knowing that their lifespan is 5 years if no misfortunes happen, had established some relationship with the business sector just in case. And that mutual interpenetration has corrupted many things. That's why certain decisions can be taken. Spoenyanda said by 2009 people will have Christmas, every cell phone charge per minute will be 75 cents. ICASA said we agree as a regulatory company. What happened? MTN and Vodacom said, what have you been smoking? We're not going to do that. And that is power. Up to this day, that never changed. Commission after commission, the banking sector, you deposit money, you pay. You check your balance, you pay. You withdraw your money, you pay. You do not do anything, you pay. This is the best. And I've lived in different countries, you don't pay for depositing in many countries. Then they say this is the best performing banking system. And over time, they have found a way, knowing that political parties might be battling in terms of financing their conferences and so forth. And of late, you know that whenever there is a gala dinner, you search very hard for leaders. They've been taken into some holding room by the corporates. That's where power is. So what is the space for the political leaders to transform radically? And remember, these South African corporates are linked to the global corporates. So the punishment is swift if you try to be creative. So sometimes we should remember Amilcar Cabral when he says, tell no lies and claim no easy victories. The transition is complex, even for the ANC. And the ANC is busy cannibalizing itself. For many people, it was the only remaining hope on which to rise and transform. I just want to end with this. Of course, all these things do not preclude that there may actually be some radical policies, because with the world where resource nationalism is so widespread across the world, then it might just be possible to have some radical, changes. But the other thing, the ANC's broad church concept must have been a very powerful mobilizing tool, because when you have a simpler enemy, apartheid regime, you could simply mobilize everybody. But now, the broad church concept militate against policy clarity and strategic clarity. Because you say, I can't offend anybody. If I move this way, I'll offend the business sector. If I move this way, I'll offend the workers. If I move straight, I'll offend, Sanko. If I move this way, I'll offend traditional leaders. So each time the strategic ambiguity has become the character. And as such, I can tell you that even the National Planning Commission will try to look for the language hygiene that will not offend anybody. So that courage and boldness and clarity of vision might be needed. And the other worrying factor is that because Mbeki was a centralizing president who was seen as becoming autocratic, the current president has swung the pendulum to the other extreme. He consults and waits and wouldn't stick his neck out. on some of these things, to a point where people might think he defers things like the national plan to the ministers. So that in itself also might have its delayed reaction challenge. So in South Africa, just to close, we suffer from honesty deficit. We suffer from courage deficit. We suffer from common sense deficit. Common sense, like taking books from a warehouse to schools, takes 7 months. And then there is a very complicated debate. And you know that if you ask my aunt in the village, they would have long organized some bakkies to get it there. We always opt for most complex solutions to the simplest problems. Why? It's because we want to mystify the state in order to mystify accountability. Simple, practical things. Now it's like we're planning, like NASA, how to land this rocket on Mars. What will be the climate there? How many years it will take? Just to take books, which after a month you would say, if they are not there, I'm closing this department, everybody put books in the trunk of your car or your boot. Let's take them to these schools. Here is the delivery note, people sign, and then we come back. On the second month, if it's not happening, you ask the army, because it's a national crisis. We have brought in army to carry the books, but because in between we must deliberate on tenders. Hey, so-and-so was almost getting this tender and so forth, the Range Rover that he had just deposited for, and so forth. That's when the society has lost common sense. Our education system is too complicated. We used to pass, we went to international universities because the education system was simpler. We went for the best practice, which we often look for the first world countries. We can't even. That's why e-tolling, some people are saying it was projected that it could have spent 90 billion just administratively for a project which was 20 billion. Why? Because it's complex. We love complexity. When we sit in the adjudication of tenders, the person who confuses you most is the one you suspect will do the job, and you appoint that person. You say, it looks like Libra EIS. You could see the slides were flying. And then when he gives you something you can't understand, you politely put it in the drawer because you don't understand it. Then the other deficit is a leadership deficit. I know many people, when you talk of a leadership deficit, they start thinking that you're talking about President Zuma. No, it's a widespread in churches, in communities, in the families, in the schools. Everywhere. Where church used to be a node of development, now priests are fighting over deployments and they are buying complicated pulpits, and yet their congregants are starving. And the last one is the leadership deficit. I mean, it's the vision deficit. This country lacks a vision that would rally everybody around and appeal to everybody and take us forward. I have my reservations about the national plan as to whether it will do that. I have a reservation about the champions who will champion that project because we're still busy cannibalizing ourselves. The negative energy of leaders trying to fight it out is so much. But again, if you look at the World Cup, when South Africa has a clear project and all partners participate and throw themselves into that project, nothing can stop us. Thank you.